Our buddy David Pakman did an interview with a woman named Brianna Wu on the issue of Gamergate. So let's listen, and then I want to break it down.
Gamergate they're the ones that are harassing me. But I would ask you to consider, I've been thinking about these issues for years.
Yeah.
And I think there's a deeper issue here. And this is why I would ask you to understand, and why I would ask for your viewers to understand. The people that are responding to Gamergate are responding to a culture that has been in video games for 30 years. You know, when I was growing up, my first video game system was a Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. You know, this was a system that started with Princess Peach being kidnapped and, you know, damsel in distress. And it quickly became this culture that was, you know, women as very sexualized trophies as your reward. Players almost always being male. Games marketed to men. I can remember being a child and being in an arcade and there being a game called Smash TV where your reward for beating the game was going into the Pleasure Dome, where your muscle-bound male character sat on a throne with bikinied women like lauding him after he beat the game. And there were huge posters in the arcade promoting this. What I'm trying to say is Gamergate is a symptom of a deeper industry problem.
My question, though, is...
Hold on, let me finish. I'll take all the time you need. Right now, games are made for men, developed for men, and marketed for men. And it's signaling to the games are a space for men. That has the consequence that when women like myself come in here and ask to be represented, gamers feel like it's their space, which is why you see Gamergate's frankly feminists raising these issues. Does that make sense to you? Do you see the broader picture?
I think that your picture is not broad enough. And here's where I would go with this.
Sure.
I grant you that the issues you've identified within the video game industry exist. Okay. However, I don't know that you're looking at it broadly enough in the sense that for 30 years or however long whatever period we want to look at the internet through, we've seen the same phenomena within online talk and news programs, which are predominantly male and predominantly marketed to males. Online pornography, which is predominantly produced by males, marketed to males, and consumed by males. This, to me, seems like it is not different than the broader issue we have on the internet.
I think there's an unfair characterization by progressive media of gamers. So there was one day, this was back when Gamergate was first starting, and it was multiple progressive sites that released articles that claimed in no uncertain terms that the gaming community is misogynistic. And I remembered reading one article being stunned by the broad sweeping generalization in the article where they're not trying to be specific in any way. They're just saying, yeah, there's a problem in the gaming community, and it is that they are misogynistic. And then they provided some sort of BS fluffy argument to attempt to back it up, which I think failed tremendously. And this also appears to be the claim of Brianna Wu here as well. And I think it's a fairly silly argument to make, because stop and think about it. There are so many different things in this world that we live in, and to try to focus on specific things and say there is a flat-out anti-woman bias in this respect, well, I don't think that makes much sense, because to me that's like pointing out, imagine you point out all the different sports leagues and you say, well, there's an anti-woman bias. It's like, well, what do you mean there's an anti-woman bias? Well, there's an anti-woman bias when it comes to the MLB or when it comes to the NBA. No, it's just that that's what men like in higher numbers. That's an objective fact. Now, you could have a conversation about, well, maybe that has something to do with how people were raised and what they were indoctrinated into, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very interesting conversation to have, and it's one that sociologists have been having forever. And you could come out on whatever side you want, and you could, give some sort of framework for your position. But to say that, well, the gaming community is misogynistic or it's sexist, that doesn't make any more sense than saying, well, the movie industry is sexist. It's like when the guy did the shooting in California and then a feminist wrote an article, a radical feminist wrote an article saying, I blame Seth Rogen and Judd Apatow movies for this. And everybody was like, what? Why? They say, well, in those movies, you see that Seth Rogen is going out with a girl, and it turns out that the girl is like his prize at the end of the movie, and he really likes her, and he has to sweep her off her feet, and it's just this terrible gender roles thing, and all men have expectations about what a woman is supposed to be based off of that movie. Let me ask you a question. How is that any different from when the conservatives say, oh, when there's gun violence in movies, that leads to gun violence? How is that any different? It's not. It's the exact same argument. Any argument that treats art as anything more than art, I immediately dismiss you. I mean, that's like taking out, a rap album and listening to it and acting like, well, people are going to reenact every aspect of this because it's in the album. It's like saying you went to go watch Rambo and now you want to go shoot people's faces off. It's like saying video games lead to violence. But they don't. They've done empirical studies. It doesn't lead to violence. So you have to look at things for what they are. And in terms of the video game industry, I mean, the video game industry is marketed to men largely because men like video games more than women. And I don't think that's sexist. I mean, if you want to try to do some sort of initiative to get more women into those things, by all means, go right ahead and you can try to do that. But if at the end of the day, women still don't want to use video games and men do in a much higher numbers, that doesn't mean that they're sexist. I mean, what we should be in favor of as progressives is equality of opportunity. And then if people with that opportunity choose not to go down certain paths, that's fine. We have to be okay with that. And so what? Unless every industry and the hiring practices in every industry across the board is a perfect representation of what the percentages of men and women are in society, then it's sexist. So that means that for all professional sports leagues, it needs to be 50% male, 50% female in terms of viewership, in terms of employees. That means for other areas that have a higher percentage, like David brings up, internet talk, for example. That means unless there's 50% female talkers, 50% male talkers, and unless the audience is 50% male, 50% female, that it's sexist? No, you should have the equal opportunity and the freedom to choose whatever you want to do, but if those things don't perfectly represent 50-50 in the population in terms of gender roles, that doesn't mean it's sexist. So this argument, it seems so disingenuous to me. And later on in there, she goes on to accuse David Pakman of doing a hit piece. Of all the people that have never in history done a hit piece, I believe David Pakman is number one on that list. He just asks her fairly tough questions because she's making a lot of very broad claims about Gamergate and the video game community in general, and I think she's wrong to do that. Now understand, if there are specific situations of individuals who happen to be gamers that do something negative, they hack somebody or I think the original situation was about there was some sort of picture released of or some sort of information released about a woman and she didn't want it released and some gamer did it. It's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate to say that guy's a dick and that guy shouldn't have done X, Y, or Z, and you can criticize individual people. But when you start going after industries and when you start going after the gamer community, that's just as broad as looking at one situation where one black guy robs a liquor store and then you say, well, you know how the blacks are. That's how they are. No, it was an individual who did it. Again, to me, these things seem obvious. What I want people to do, let's focus, when it comes to sexism, real sexism exists, okay? It does. Why not focus on the real sexism and not take away the credibility from other arguments where there is real sexism? For example, overall in the economy, women make 77 cents to a man's dollar. For the same work, though, this is the more important fact, there's still a pay gap. It's about 91 cents to a man's dollar. Okay, I'm with you on that. Let's go march. Let's go fight for equal pay for equal work. Let's go fight to get the Equal Pay Act passed. Let's go fight to re-up the Violence Against Women Act. I'm with you on real cases of sexism. But when you argue that unless the video game industry perfectly makes 50-50 video games in terms of gender roles and has 50-50 representation in terms of employment, when you argue that and you argue that the entire video game community is misogynistic, you sound silly because that is a silly argument.